Welcome back to Conservative Conversations. I'm your host, Reid.
And I'm Frank.
Today we're going to be talking about the European Union elections and the prospects of the Trump campaign versus the Biden campaign. So let's get started. And before we get started, listeners, if you haven't yet, please go follow us on your favorite podcast platform, and you can also subscribe on our YouTube channel. We would greatly appreciate it. And to start off real quick, since our last episode, the big news about Donald Trump's case in New York had come out, and that the jury had found him guilty on all 34 counts. And it doesn't really seem to matter to most people, because people are still showing up by the thousands to his rallies, and he's raised
almost $400 million. He
millions of dollars towards the campaign. And like I said, it doesn't seem to really matter too much.
No, and they were talking, somebody from his campaign was talking about how a lot of those, a big chunk of that $400 million he's claiming, have been from just small donations, like less than $50.
Right.
You know, so there's a lot of little people out there who still seem to care.
Yeah, definitely. It's showing in the polls and the fundraising numbers, and in the number of people showing up to his rallies. I mean, when's the last time you seen Joe Biden get tens of thousands, nearly hundreds of thousands?
I've seen some comparisons on this, and there are some instances where, you know, Sleepy Joe can barely get 100 people to a thing.
Oh, wow.
Now, I mean, I don't want to be quoted on that. I don't know the venue or the space or what they planned for, but there's somewhere it's like him and 6 press people, you know? I mean, you know what I mean? Like him, the press people, and maybe 6 supporters is more of what I meant to say. But
yeah, not counting his family.
Right. So there's definitely a disparity there between the two campaigns.
Oh, yeah, for sure. For sure.
But anyway, to pick up on that, the first thing that I kind of wanted to talk about was how I have seen some compilations and some clips and things coming out from the liberal news outlets, where they have just been really hitting this thing. I'm sure you've heard some of the quotes where Trump says he's going to be a dictator on day one. You know, and that kinds of, he's made some claims like this.
Yeah, and then they try to play it as if he's going to be like an authoritarian dictator,
actual
like
dictator,
a Nazi or something.
Exactly. Well, he's said some other things. He's done some interviews here recently. There was a really good one. He sat down with Dr. Phil for just a little over an hour. The link will be in the show notes. I highly recommend it. I mean, if you know Trump and have followed him, then a lot of it's just repetitious. You know, he says a lot of the same things, but there are some interesting nuances to it because, like, Dr. Phil, I didn't know this, but he did a lot of study, kind of like an old friend of ours, Barbara Tarter. He did a lot of study on juries as part of his, like, doctoral thesis or whatever, and his psychology stuff, you know? And so Dr. Phil actually had a really good angle on this interview and about, you know, the trial that Trump has just been through and how it seems like the deck is sort of stacked against him, you know, by Alvin Bragg and the Department of Justice and all the way up to the White House. But, you know, Dr. Phil even took the opportunity and asked Trump about some of these things, about how Trump has said he's going to be a dictator on day one. And I think what Trump is more like trying to say, the point he's trying to make by this dictator talk, is because he sees the immigration problem as being so bad that he almost he doesn't want to clear it through anybody, through border control, through the Department of Justice, through Congress. He just wants to do what he keeps saying is the biggest mass deportation in our United States history. He just wants to deport people. And that's what he's talking about. I'm pretty sure. I mean, I don't want to, you know, be on the hook for this if this isn't what he means, but it seems to me that That's more like what he's talking about, is he's going to go in and just say, deport them, you know? And that's sort of what he means by he wants to look or act like a dictator on day one. But when he was talked about when he was asked by Dr. Phil about political retribution, as far as like going out, going to prosecute somebody like Obama or somebody like Hillary Clinton or, other actors like that, people who spied on his campaign, some of these people in the Department of Justice, some of the people who wrote the Steele dossier, that kinds of stuff. He said very eloquently and very beautifully that, in his mind, he had an opportunity to go after Hillary Clinton the first time.
Right.
He picked on her as an example because she's such a good one. He talked about how he would go on these rallies all across the country and people would be chanting, lock her up, lock her up. You remember that?
Yep.
And he said that he would always try his best to sort of quiet down the crowds, and he gets where they're coming from and why they would chant stuff like that. He said, but he thought it would look bad for the country, and he's never wanted to do that. He really seems to care about the country as a whole and about it staying cohesive. And he said to take somebody who was the wife of a president, somebody who was the Secretary of State, and then persecute them from the White House, and try to put them behind bars. He said he could have done it. Whether or not that's right or wrong, I think that's a different discussion, but he seems to think that he could have done it, put her behind bars. But he says, I didn't want to do that.
Right.
Yeah. It's the sort of shoe on the other foot test, Right. And he says that even though it's happening to him, he wouldn't want his political enemies, so to speak, he wouldn't want their children to be persecuted, prosecuted, locked up like the way his children are hated, some of them more than others. But, he wouldn't want to just go after Hillary Clinton or Chelsea Clinton or any of this. And he basically said that he would be happy to put everything behind him, just water under the bridge, and take the country into the future. And that's one of the things that he was really dwelling on in a sense, but it's one of those nuanced things, And he pointed out, he said, revenge takes time. Well, I'll be darned if that's one of the exact quotes that the liberal media is running with. A day later, 2 days later, he's saying revenge takes time.
It's like the bloodbath thing from a couple of weeks or a month or so ago.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're trying to spin it like, he's had all this time to think of who he's going to go after and who he's going to get. But the point that he was making was it would take time away from him trying to right the country, put the country back on the right path, and it would take time out of his 4 years. He would only have 4 years to do as much good as he can, and he says that it would take time, like time away from his efforts, But they just take that little 2-second clip, and they're just running with it on MSNBC and other outlets like that. So it just kind of hurt my heart because that was such a good interview, and I really think Trump is a good guy. I mean, every listener out there might not agree with me.
Sure.
But I think he's a good guy. And if you really pay attention to the nuance of Trump, these clips that get abused, it doesn't fit the spirit of the man or what he's saying.
Right.
So I just wanted to bring that up and mostly plug the interview because I'm not the hugest Dr. Phil fan, but I didn't know that he had done so much work with juries, and he really brought some interesting insight to these trials, against Trump and everything. And I thought it was a great interview.
Well, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I mean, I've certainly made comments before about how even for his first run for president, they've try to call him like a dictator, an authoritarian.
They said he wouldn't leave office.
Right, and a fascist and all this. And I've mentioned before, the way you can tell he's not any of those things, because he's not the president, and he's left office. And I don't know what makes them think he's not going to leave again.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's a good point, because there's these mashups, you can find them on the internet, where the Democrats have challenged almost every Republican win, going back to, I mean, at least Bush Jr., maybe even before. I don't know.
Right.
But they've challenged everything. I mean, you remember the scandal with Al Gore,
Right.
And people say, well, Al Gore really won, not Bush. Well, basically since, what was that, 2000?
Mm-hmm.
So 24 years, give or take a couple, they've been challenging every Republican win and saying that it wasn't legitimate and that the elections were stolen in similar wording. Okay, maybe not that exact wording. But when Republicans do it, it's the end of the world.
Right, exactly. I think it's looking better and better for Trump that he's going to win again. I mean, because if people just... I think all it really takes is, one, the constant comparison between the two administrations, how much things were better during Trump's first term and how they are now.
Right.
It also just show how much Joe Biden has declined and how terrible he even is. Like, he can barely even read his teleprompters when he's able to even read them.
Well, right, and that's a good point. That's one of the things at the very end of this interview with Dr. Phil, because it stretched on for more than an hour. And even after Dr. Phil said his, goodbyes, his final line that he had prepared or whatever, well, as the camera's like panning out and they're rolling the credits and stuff, Dr. Phil and Trump still sit there and talk some more. And that's one of the things Trump says is, I doubt Biden could have done an hour and 10-minute interview with no breaks, no water, no, getting up and walking around, no having an ice cream cone in the middle of it.
Well, I hadn't had this prepared to talk about, but there's this, I think it was like last week or something, this big interview with Time magazine, maybe it was, that Joe Biden had done with the reporter. And they released the transcript, and even people reading the transcript, it sounds like he can barely keep his thoughts together.
No, I heard that. There were like at least 3 points where they had to put unintelligible in the transcript.
Right, yeah.
Because they can't even tell what he's saying.
I mean, out of all the interviews that Trump does, I don't know how often somebody would have to write unintelligible.
Well, it's not unintelligible. And where they get him is sometimes he does these quick transitions, like where he'll move from one topic to another.
Yeah.
And people, kind of, I'll just say it, they kind of screw with that. They kind of mess with, they'll say, well, he went from A to Z, with no transition, and make him look crazy. But in his mind, it does make sense. And it does make sense too. I mean, it was something they were talking about earlier. It relates back to a different thing, But just to put a cherry on top of that, at what we've been saying, is Trump just did a rally out in Arizona, just maybe yesterday, I think it was, or I don't know, maybe today or very recently. But supposedly it was like 110-degree weather.
Oh,
and he's there in a suit.
In Nevada, and they were lined up, long line at 7 a.m.
Yeah, and he's there in a suit for about an hour, giving a speech, no breaks, in front of a crowd. Just all of it, I mean, a lot of it's just off the top of his head. He doesn't sit there and follow along with some teleprompter or whatever.
Yeah.
And, so I mean, there's a lot to highlight there between the two. When Trump sat down with Dr. Phil, he had some notes in front of him, but it wasn't like he was reading off little note cards that tell him everything to say. Like,
tell him what questions he can answer, or else he'll get in trouble.
Exactly.
With his people.
I mean, that was one of the things that drove people nuts with Trump, is he would answer any question you asked him.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, I don't. If the comparison between the two candidates isn't stark enough, I don't know what else we can do.
Amen, brother.
Yeah. But I guess we'll move on to my first full topic. I don't really have a whole lot to say, although other than I think it's kind of interesting. There's the recent European Union Parliament elections that took place just the other day as we're recording. And I think the biggest news that's come out of this is what's going on with France. But before I mentioned that, I saw a couple bits of data about the elections I thought were kind of interesting. There are 27 countries, I believe, 26 or 27 countries in the European Union. And between them, they speak 24 languages. And there's roughly 330-something million voters. And does that 330-something million number sound familiar to you?
It's like the population of the United States.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going for. And when I first saw that, I thought to myself, well, geez, I can't imagine the United States being made up of, states that speak different languages, all trying to vote on some strange government that rules us all while we all still have our own individual governments, and then even more government below that, which I guess kind of sounds like the United States, but we're talking about countries voting for a big government body to tell all the countries what to do. And all these countries have different, cultures and ways of life of their own, whereas generally speaking, most states in America are fairly similar in our collective culture.
Well, you're exactly right on multiple levels. I mean, this sort of concept would have scared our founders to death.
Right. So I just thought it was kind of mind-boggling that all these competing interests are trying to vote on one big governing body to rule them all. It sounds bonkers to me.
Well, it is bonkers because it's almost like having a post-facto federation,
Right.
And how could you unify that many different people?
Right. But then yet, like I mentioned a moment ago, some of the biggest news came out from France. One of their leading, as a lot of the headlines say, far-right parties got like 30% of the vote for France in the European Parliament.
Right.
I mean, even trying to talk about this is kind of confusing to me, because it's the people in France voted for the representatives in the EU, and like 30-something% of the votes were given to this one party. So I guess President Macron in France, or
Right.
Prime Minister, are they the same guy? I don't know.
I think it's president.
Right. Well, that guy, Macron, decided he was going to dissolve the French Assembly Parliament and have new elections.
Snap election.
Yeah, snap elections is what the phrase is that they keep using. Which, from my understanding, that's not too abnormal to do in that type of system, but I guess as somebody who doesn't live under a parliamentary system, that sounds even just as bonkers to me as the whole European Union elections are. That all of a sudden, the guy in charge says, we're just going to everybody's going to vote for new assembly members again, all of a sudden.
Well, to me, it just speaks to not having a very strong constitution, because like ours are outlined, like we have certain days that we vote, and they're set in stone, and nobody in power can just say, oh, guess what? Now we're going to all vote tomorrow, and if you can't vote tomorrow, then you don't get to vote,
Right.
But it seems like you can do that. There's a lot of other systems where they seem to be able to do that kind of thing.
Right. And from my understanding, I guess he's doing it because he thinks he's going to be able to show that the people in France don't actually want these far-right representatives, but I'm not sure.
Well, that's one of the things, I don't want to cut in,
Sure.
but I was going to piggyback on this. I was going to talk about some of this EU stuff too. And the way I have it in my notes is it's an attempt, these are my words, but it's an attempt to shore up the status quo now, because before he called for the snap election, right? Just follow me here for a minute.
Right, yeah.
There was going to be a date on which everybody was going to vote. And that was kind of known. It was upcoming. It was going to be a while, but there was going to be a regular vote day, so to speak. But he thinks that by ending the parliament early, calling for snap elections sooner, he'll be able to capture more of like his base, if you will, and kind of throw off, because there's this female, I didn't catch her name, but she's running as the sort of right wing.
Is Le Pen or something like that?
Yeah.
Marine Le Pen.
Right. And she's sort of running as his opposition. And I think what he's doing is like he's reading the writing on the wall, the way this EU vote went. And he's thinking, oh, man, if people are really feeling this way, what can I do to, sort of shore up my base and my stronghold? And so he's saying, well, let's throw them off.
Right.
They thought they were going to vote on, I'm just going to make up a date, but they thought they were going to vote on August 1st, 2026. Well, let's do it on July 24th, 2025.
Right.
So.
Right. Well, part of what at least from what I read that I understand, is the election for his office, he still has his seat for another couple of years.
Yes.
So I don't know. It's all sounds silly to me. But part of also what I wanted to mention is not only were there like large far right, scare quotes, turnout in France, it was also in a couple other countries like Germany and Italy. And we've sort of been seeing this kind of thing going on for a little while because at least the people who are voting in those more right-leaning parties in Europe are getting tired of some of the same issues we're getting tired of. Like the immigration, the green agenda.
The fiscal policy.
Yeah, the fiscal policies too. Yeah, of course. And, even though I mentioned like all these countries have their own, ways of doing things and their own agendas, it's clear that there's a commonality amongst most people across at least the Western world that they don't really like big government like that. And it seems like a lot of people are trying to stand up to it across the Western countries, which hopefully will kind of continue in a positive way, because some of the concerns I've heard, and partly why they call these groups far right, is at least in France, supposedly their ties to Moscow or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
But
that doesn't sound like fake news.
I mean, I don't really know. It's not anything I've investigated. It may or may not be true, but I guess the only thing, my point would be that, hopefully all these, groups are certainly well-intentioned.
Well, I would hope so too, and
right.
I find it encouraging.
Yeah, me too. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
I mean, I do see a potential for it to not be good.
Sure.
But I see it as encouraging. Just like you, yeah.
Because especially like the immigration issue, because I feel like that's been a bigger problem over there longer than it has been here. Is that a lot of these people that are coming into their countries aren't assimilating like people used to, and they're not adopting the way of life to the local culture, and they're just, it causes problems.
In a manner of speaking, they're terrorists to the existing system.
Yeah. And I would expect the same from, if the roles were reversed and a bunch of people were moving into like Asian or African countries, the local people there would surely expect the Europeans to adopt their way of life there locally. So, if you're coming to Europe or to America, you should be expected to do the same thing. And it
Yep.
seems like that's at least one part of what people over there are getting tired of is the immigration issue. So, but that's mostly all I had about like the European Union. So it's kind of surprising. I, of course, didn't even know the elections were going on, and of course, the biggest news I heard about was this whole French Parliament thing, which I thought sounded kind of crazy. So I wanted to look at it, and I guess it's not that crazy. It's just I don't quite understand it. So I don't know. It's interesting.
Well, I'm glad that you wanted to bring this up because I also wanted to talk about it. And of course, we don't always have the exact same ideas.
Sure.
We're two different men and look at things, from two different sets of eyes and all of that. But what I love about this piece is what it shows to me. One of the nuances here is that Macron is worried.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And that there are other people in the EU that are worried by this news. And there's other people here in the United States that are worried by this news. And it's causing worry,
Right.
And I sort of love it because I think the United Nations is a joke. I think, we could do a whole segment on the United Nations and why the first United Nations, the League of Nations, fell. It was one of President Wilson's brainchild.
Yeah.
It didn't work. Like I sort of alluded to, this sort of concept would scare our founding fathers to death. I know it would. It doesn't work. Margaret Thatcher fought and fought and fought not to be part of the EU, not to give up the English pound and go to like a euro dollar. That scared her to pieces. So I think it's interesting. I will just opine and say this before I get into my other points, but what I find most exciting is I'd love to see the EU hit like a critical mass where people from within the EU could dissolve the EU.
Right. Yeah.
Because we've already seen countries like Britain do their Brexit thing and say, oh boy, this was a mistake. We got to get out of here. We got to, we got to turn and run. And like you're saying, it seems like there's people waking up and realizing that this sort of a bureaucracy, you can argue that they don't have very much power or aren't very effective, but goodness sakes, are they a drain on resources?
Yeah.
So to have that kind of overhead and that kind of bureaucracy on these small countries, I'd almost love to see a point where they could just dissolve it from within,
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there. To get back to the other points that I was going to make is I was going to talk about Joe Biden. In my first piece, I kind of talked about Trump. In this piece, I'm going to talk about Joe Biden. So he just went over and he was seen with President Macron for the 80th anniversary of D-Day. And he did this there was this weird moment that occurred that's made all kinds of headlines where some people believed, and it did look like, he sort of stopped in one particular moment and doo-dooed in his pants. Have you heard about this?
Yeah, I've heard about that.
Okay, well, it's not true, okay? He got confused about whether he should sit down or not.
Yeah, that's what I've heard.
But what I love is, all these outlets, the fact checker outlets, Snopes, and, some of the more liberal outlets and everything, they've ended up pretty much having to print headlines that say, no, Biden didn't poop his pants. So I'm sorry, not to pick on the guy or anything, but I just find it funny how the news works.
Well, the fact that it's even in question is enough.
Yes, I know. It's just slightly comical. Thought I'd bring a little comedy to it. But I also think, if you look at it in the totality of things, Biden is not a strong leader.
No,
he doesn't look strong. He doesn't. if anything, just to flip that phrase on its head, he's an embarrassment to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I'll mention Afghanistan as I have before. That was an embarrassment to the United States. Happened under his leadership. This is an embarrassment. There's multiple instances of this, of him falling down, him, doing this or that or the other thing. And so I find that, especially piggybacking off of the comments about Macron that we just made recently, here he was with Biden. He must have been thinking that this would look good. France and United States standing strong,
Mm-hmm.
And then Biden totally poops the bed, as they say, to use another idiom, And so I can kind of see why Macron, on the back of this D-Day thing, on the back of the EU elections seeming to go far right, on the back of this challenge that he's having with, what did you say her name was, Le Pen?
I believe I said Marine Le Pen.
Uh-huh. I can see why all of a sudden he's like, you know what? Forget it. Let's have snap elections right now. Because it's like he doesn't want these things to run in the media and to look weak. Right. And like he's hanging out with weak people and has weak alliances. And so let's shore up the status quo right now.
Right.
So I don't know how much nuance that adds really, but I do think that there's something there. I mean, it at least has occurred to me that I think he's thinking, man, I've made some mistakes here. I'm not looking too good.
Right, yeah. Right, because it does seem to me like if he believed he was secure in his seat in his party and people wanting his party to represent them, he wouldn't be worried about it. He wouldn't have to have these elections.
Right.
He'd just leave it as it is. It's and say I'm not worried about it. We're just gonna keep on moving. I'm not scared of these far right, whatever they call them over there.
Sure, you might just say far right trends because it seems to be trending that way.
Sure, yeah.
But one of the other things that I was going to mention, just sort of lighthearted, but one of the things I've experimented with is I created a Facebook account, the Frank Reynolds. You can find me on Facebook, Frank Reynolds, and I saw somebody shared with me on there. So shout out to all my Facebook friends. But apparently there's a trend going around now on like TikTok or YouTube Shorts or those Instagram Reels or whatever, where people are doing this thing called Do the Biden, and it's where like somebody will turn their cell phone on you real fast and they'll say Do the Biden, and what you're supposed to do is just stop and squat.
Oh my goodness.
So, just a little levity to the segment here, but
we're first think I'm wearing moon shoes to help him not fall over. These big goofy shoes.
I don't know. I didn't see that, but it took me a while to figure out what they were even doing. But I finally pieced it together that they're kind of mocking what he did over in France, but just sort of interesting. I mean, it's interesting how the media works and how, these social networking things move. And Biden really doesn't look strong for the United States.
No, and like
or
I
anybody
said,
else.
People just, like, if all the media was actually honest, they'd show these clips of how terrible he is. But they won't. I mean, if Trump stumbles down the ramp a little bit, they'll play that on loop. But if it looks like Joe Biden's taking a squat while he's trying to sit, they won't show you that.
I'll just mention one other thing because it just occurred to me, but I saw a great meme on Facebook too where it said somebody's asking Biden a question and they say, "Hey Biden, do you wear boxers or briefs?" And he throws a thumbs up and says,
"Oh, yeah. I've heard that one."
So, I don't know. It's just funny,
Yeah.
That's all it is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I'll put a cherry on top of this one real quick. Even finally, you got people like Jimmy Kimmel making fun of him now.
Mm-hmm.
For a while, they wouldn't really make too many jokes about him. Just like back in the Obama days, it was tough for those guys to make jokes about Obama. But now everybody knows how disastrous Joe Biden is, so it's okay. You can make fun of him if you want to.
Well, and you should be able to.
Yes, exactly.
You think of SNL, and they do their weekend update talking about the news and making little puns and jokes and stuff.
Right.
And this is a free country, First Amendment. We ought to be able to poke fun at those in power. So,
right, I'm certainly not trying to suggest that Jimmy Kimmel shouldn't be. I'm just glad to see that he finally is, given that the jokes have been there the whole time and they could have been making them, but to keep the narrative, they wouldn't.
Exactly. That's the point that I was trying to highlight, is there's been this sort of like unspoken rule that you don't touch them. They're untouchable.
Right.
Leave them alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, is that all you got?
That's all I got.
Okay. All right, then real quick, I'll do my last topic here. Recently, the jobs report came out for the month of May, and there are some mixed messages in the report. When these reports come out, the Labor Department uses two different surveys. They use the household survey, and they also use the establishment, or what they call the payroll survey. And the payroll survey is one that shows that 272,000 jobs were added for the month of May, which beat the expectations, which were around 190,000 jobs were expected to be added.
That sounds good.
Right. The survey also shows that 68,000 of those jobs came from the healthcare sector. 43,000 of those jobs came from the government, and then 42,000 came from leisure and hospitality, which does make sense because we're getting into that time of year where people usually spend more and
vacations.
Yes, exactly.
That kind of thing, yeah.
And at least out of those three groups, some of the criticism is the government jobs adding 43,000 out of the 272,000, which is a decent number, and we all know that government jobs are only paid by tax dollars. Well, I shouldn't say only, but pretty much. That's how they get paid, is from our tax dollars. So in order to pay all those jobs, you have to get taxed for it.
Yeah, you're still sucking money out of the economy.
Right, exactly. So that's one thing that is kind of mixed message about the reports. And then going to the household survey, it showed that about 280,000 jobs added were part-time jobs.
Oh, that's good. I was going to ask you about that.
Mm-hmm. But it shows a loss of a little over 600,000 full-time jobs.
That's not so good.
No. And another difference between the two surveys is in the payroll survey, it counts the same worker twice if that worker has more than one job. So it's not really as if they're counting one person who went from having no job to having a job. It could be the one person who already had a job who now has another job. But the household survey does not. It only counts the worker once.
Well, then I'll tell you, I didn't want to add too much to this segment, but I have a situation that I've been dealing with my staff, where I have somebody moving from full-time to part-time. So it seems to me that the household number would be more accurate. And plus, I think, this is just my speculation, but, there was a problem that was highlighted during the pandemic where you had these retirees rejoining the workforce because they needed money and all this stuff. They should be retired.
Right.
And I bet, this is just frank betting here, but I bet you're seeing a big move or we're going to continue to see a big move of people moving from part-time to from full-time to part-time, because you're seeing these retirees or people who should be retired,
Right.
Maybe they can't afford to work, they can't afford to not work, but they're too old and they're too tired and they're too overworked to do it full-time anymore.
Right.
So they're sliding into these part-time positions where they can still make a little bit of money, but they're not working 7 days a week.
Right.
5 days a week, whatever,
Right. I didn't have the number written down, but one of the other things that I believe the household survey showed was that the labor participation rate had dropped. So less people are in the workforce.
Which is not good.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you, I'd take the household numbers if I were a betting man. If I were Warren Buffett trying to figure out what to do with my money.
Right. Well, and then the last number, which I've heard twice talked about, is that since Joe Biden took office, the net jobs added for native-born Americans, 0%. Like there has not been an increase of net jobs added for native-born Americans since 2020.
That's sort of astounding, isn't it?
While there has been a 14% increase for foreign-born workers since 2020.
Wow. And that really speaks to something we've covered before.
Yeah, plenty of times, the immigration issue.
Well, not just that, but the idea that Americans don't want to do these jobs.
Supposedly.
Right, exactly. We've talked about that plenty, and I just don't think that that's true.
Right. Yeah, so I'm sure the White House and the administration is probably going to be pumping up the 227,000 jobs added, but I'm not sure how much you'll also hear about some of the negative numbers. And as usual, next month there'll be a revision to these numbers, so it's not unlikely
that they backslide.
Right, and they also could go the other way, but usually when they do the revisions, they usually go down.
Yes, and it's quiet. It's in the dead of night. The revisions don't get published the way that the announcements do.
Right, yep.
So you heard it here first. I'm kind of glad we got in this segment because it's not as good as it seems.
Right, yep. Right, I thought if I didn't say this a second ago, I was also going to mention the unemployment rate has gone up to 4%, where for like months on months now, it's been just under 4%.
And I'm sure they expected it to fall. They always project,
Right.
That's another one of those revisionist things. Yeah.
Right, yep. And the last thing I'll point or mention is that, of course, this has people talking about, well, is the Fed going to lower the rates, or are they going to raise the rates, or what are they going to do with their next meeting?
Well, they're not going to lower them.
No, that's what most people are suggesting. With this information, they're not going to be lowered, and I doubt they'll raise them either, because they've also mentioned how the Fed doesn't like to mess with anything when it gets close to the election.
Well, and that hits another point that we've discussed before, too. They probably should raise the rates.
Yeah. But that's all I had on some of the jobs report and the kind of economic outlook. It's mixed messaging right now, and I'm certainly no economist, but I'm pretty sure the market, as it is not very fond of uncertainty. And mixed reports like these do not spell certainty.
Well, I'll tell you, I love this segment because I think our outlook is pretty bleak, and I think highlighting uncertainty matters.
Right, yeah.
So I'm glad we could do it.
Yep, me too. That's all I had, though. And is that all you got?
That's all I got.
Well, then, listeners, if you enjoyed this great conservative conversation, please follow on your favorite podcast platform. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and many more. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can just search at Conservative Conversations 92. We would greatly appreciate your support.
That's right. We hope you might share us with a friend or two. And as always, we thank you for listening.